The golden autumn leaves danced outside the towering windows of Rosehaven Palace as Princess Elena Victoria walked through the marble corridors that had been her home for 15 years. The 28-year-old princess had always moved with grace through these halls, but today her steps carried a weight that seemed to echo against the ornate walls. She was unaware that this would be her final morning as a welcomed member of the royal household. Queen Isabella Montrose stood in her private study, her emerald eyes scanning the morning reports that lay spread across her mahogany desk. At 52, she had ruled the kingdom of Valdoria with an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves for nearly 2 decades. Her silver hair was pulled back into an elegant chignon, and her navy blue dress spoke of authority and refinement. But beneath her composed exterior, storm clouds were gathering. The tension had been building for months, ever since Prince Alexander had married Elena in what the kingdom had celebrated as a fairy tale wedding. Alexander, the heir to the throne and Isabella's stepson, had defied royal protocol in numerous ways during his courtship with Elena. The young woman came from minor nobility, barely acceptable by royal standards, and her independent spirit had clashed repeatedly with the rigid traditions that Isabella held sacred. Elena had grown up in the countryside estate of Willowbrook, where her father served as a duke in the northern provinces. Unlike the sheltered princesses of neighboring kingdoms, Elena had been raised with a sense of freedom and personal agency that was almost revolutionary within royal circles. She rode horses without side saddle, spoke her mind in political discussions, and, worst of all in Isabella's eyes, she encouraged Alexander to question the very foundations of royal duty and tradition. The first major incident had occurred during the spring charity gala, where Elena had publicly disagreed with the Queen's approach to poverty relief in the kingdom. While Isabella favored traditional charity work through established noble families, Elena had suggested direct government intervention and social programs that would redistribute wealth more effectively. The young princess had spoken passionately about visiting the working-class districts of the capital city, describing scenes of hardship that she felt demanded immediate royal attention. Isabella had watched from across the ballroom as Elena captivated a circle of influential nobles and foreign dignitaries with her unconventional ideas. The queen's jaw had tightened as she observed her daughter-in-law gesturing animatedly, her cheeks flushed with enthusiasm as she described her vision for a more progressive monarchy. Several ambassadors had nodded approvingly, and Isabella had noticed more than one taking notes on their phones, undoubtedly planning to report Elena's radical suggestions back to their home countries. The morning after the gala, Isabella had summoned Elena to her private chambers for what she had termed a family discussion. The conversation had been civil on the surface, but underneath lay currents of disapproval and warning that Elena had chosen to ignore. Isabella had spoken in measured tones about the importance of maintaining royal dignity and following established precedents that had served the monarchy for generations. Elena had listened respectfully, but her response had been firm and unwavering. She explained that she felt a responsibility to use her position to advocate for meaningful change, rather than simply serving as a decorative figure at ceremonial events. She spoke about letters she had received from citizens describing their struggles, and her belief that the royal family had a moral obligation to address systemic inequalities within the kingdom. The conversation had ended with polite smiles and formal courtesies, but both women had left the meeting knowing that a fundamental divide existed between them. Isabella represented tradition, stability, and the preservation of royal authority through time-tested methods. Elena embodied change, progress, and a vision of monarchy that served the people rather than simply ruling over them. Over the following months, the tension had escalated through a series of smaller conflicts. Elena had established a foundation to provide educational scholarships for children from working-class families, bypassing the traditional royal charity framework that Isabella controlled. The young princess had also begun making unscheduled visits to hospitals, schools, and community centers, often without the elaborate security protocols and media arrangements that typically accompanied royal appearances. Isabella had watched with growing alarm as Elena's popularity with the common people soared. Newspapers praised the princess's authenticity and compassion, often contrasting her approachable style with the more formal traditions of the established royal family. Social media buzzed with admiration for Elena's genuine interactions with citizens, and public opinion polls showed that she had become the most beloved member of the royal family within just 2 years of marriage. The final straw had come the previous week during a state dinner honoring the visiting Prime Minister of Celestria, a neighboring kingdom with whom Valdoria maintained delicate trade relationships. Elena had engaged the prime minister's wife in a lengthy discussion about women's rights and educational opportunities, inadvertently revealing her knowledge of certain sensitive political situations that Isabella felt were inappropriate for public discourse. The prime minister's wife, Lady Catherine Brightwater, was known throughout diplomatic circles for her sharp intellect and progressive political views. She had been impressed by Elena's informed opinions on international affairs and had later commented to the Celestrian delegation that Valdoria seemed to be developing a more modern and enlightened approach to governance under the influence of their new princess. Isabella had received reports of these conversations through her network of palace staff and diplomatic contacts. She learned that Elena had discussed proposed changes to Valdoria's foreign aid programs, expressed opinions about democratic reforms in neighboring countries, and even suggested that the kingdom might benefit from adopting more transparent financial reporting for royal expenditures. These revelations had struck at the heart of Isabella's greatest fears about Elena's influence on both Alexander and the broader perception of the monarchy. The queen had spent decades carefully managing Valdoria's image as a stable, traditional kingdom that posed no threat to established power structures in the region. Elena's progressive ideas and informal diplomatic style threatened to upset the delicate balance that Isabella had worked so hard to maintain. Alexander, meanwhile, had been caught in an increasingly difficult position between his love for his wife and his respect for his stepmother. The prince had been raised by Isabella after his mother's death when he was 12 years old, and he genuinely appreciated the stability and guidance she had provided during his formative years. At the same time, his marriage to Elena had opened his eyes to new ways of thinking about royal responsibility and the potential for positive change within the kingdom. The prince had noticed the growing tension between the two most important women in his life, but he had hoped that time and patience would eventually lead to understanding and compromise. Alexander believed that Isabella's concerns stemmed from generational differences rather than fundamental disagreements about values and priorities. He had encouraged both women to focus on their shared commitment to serving the people of Valdoria, believing that common ground could be found through respectful dialogue and mutual understanding. This morning, however, Isabella had reached a decision that would shatter any hope of peaceful coexistence. She had spent the night reviewing reports from her private secretary, Lord Hampton, who had been monitoring Elena's activities and correspondence. The documents painted a picture of a young woman who was systematically challenging royal authority and potentially undermining the stability of the monarchy itself. Among the most concerning items was a letter Elena had written to her former university professor, discussing her frustrations with royal protocol and her desire to modernize the institution from within. The letter had been intercepted by palace security as part of routine monitoring procedures, and its contents had confirmed Isabella's worst suspicions about Elena's ultimate intentions. In the letter, Elena had written about feeling constrained by traditional expectations and her hope that she could gradually influence Alexander and other royal family members to embrace more progressive policies. She had mentioned specific examples of reforms she wanted to implement, including increased transparency in royal finances, greater involvement in social justice causes, and a more accessible approach to public engagement that would bring the monarchy closer to ordinary citizens. The final paragraph of the letter had been particularly damning in Isabella's view. Elena had written that she sometimes felt like she was living in a beautiful prison where genuine change seemed impossible, and that she was determined to find ways to break free from outdated constraints that prevented the royal family from reaching its full potential as a force for positive transformation in society. Isabella had read this letter multiple times throughout the night, each reading reinforcing her conviction that Elena represented an existential threat to everything she had worked to preserve and protect. The queen had built her reign on the principle that royal authority derived from tradition, dignity, and careful maintenance of established boundaries between the monarchy and political affairs. Elena's vision of an activist royal family struck at the very foundation of Isabella's worldview. As dawn broke over the palace grounds, Isabella had made her decision. She would not allow Elena to continue undermining royal authority and potentially corrupting Alexander's understanding of his future responsibilities as king. The time for gentle corrections and private warnings had passed. More decisive action was required to protect the monarchy and preserve the stability that had made Valdoria a respected and trusted kingdom among its neighbors. The Queen had summoned Lord Hampton to her study at 7 o'clock that morning to discuss the practical arrangements for what she knew would be the most controversial decision of her reign. She had also requested that her personal attorney and the head of palace security join the meeting to ensure that every legal and procedural aspect of her plan would be properly executed. Elena, unaware of these developments, had spent her morning as usual, reviewing correspondence from various charitable organizations and planning her upcoming visit to a new women's shelter in the capital city. She had been particularly excited about this project because it represented exactly the kind of direct, meaningful engagement with social issues that she felt should be a priority for the royal family. The princess had also been working on a speech she was scheduled to deliver the following week at the annual conference of the National Education Association. Her remarks were intended to highlight the importance of equal educational opportunities for all children, regardless of their family's economic circumstances. She had spent hours crafting language that would be inspiring without being politically partisan, though she knew that any substantive discussion of educational inequality would inevitably touch on sensitive policy issues. As Elena reviewed her notes and made final revisions to her speech, she reflected on the gradual changes she had been able to implement since joining the royal family. While progress had been slower than she had hoped, she felt encouraged by the positive response from citizens and the growing support she sensed from some younger members of the royal household staff. The princess had particularly enjoyed her recent visit to a primary school in a working-class neighborhood, where she had spent the entire afternoon talking with students about their dreams and aspirations. The children's enthusiasm and genuine curiosity had reminded her why she was so committed to using her position to advocate for better opportunities and resources for young people throughout the kingdom. Elena had no way of knowing that her fate was being decided at that very moment in Queen Isabella's study, where the final details of her expulsion from the royal family were being carefully planned and documented. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 11 times as Princess Elena made her way to Queen Isabella's private study, responding to an urgent summons that had arrived with her breakfast tray. The message had been formal and brief, requesting her immediate presence for a matter of royal importance. Elena had assumed it would be another discussion about upcoming ceremonial duties or perhaps planning for the winter charity season that was approaching. She knocked gently on the heavy oak door and heard Isabella's commanding voice grant her permission to enter. As Elena stepped into the richly appointed study, she immediately sensed that something was different. The atmosphere felt charged with tension, and she noticed that 3 additional people were present: Lord Hampton, the Queen's private secretary, Sir Reginald Blackwood, the palace's chief legal counsel, and Colonel James Sterling, head of royal security. Isabella stood behind her desk, her posture rigid and formal. Her emerald eyes, usually warm during their private conversations, now held a cold determination that sent an uncomfortable chill through Elena's chest. The other men were seated in leather chairs arranged in a semicircle, their expressions serious and professionally neutral. Elena felt like she was walking into a tribunal rather than a family meeting. "Please, take a seat, Elena," Isabella said, gesturing to a single chair that had been positioned facing the group. Her voice carried none of its usual warmth, and she did not use Elena's royal title, which was unusual for any formal occasion. The princess settled into the chair, her heart beginning to race as she tried to interpret the meaning behind this unexpected gathering. Isabella remained standing, clasping her hands behind her back in a gesture that Elena had learned to associate with the Queen's most serious moments. "I have called this meeting to address concerns that have come to my attention regarding your conduct as a member of this royal family," Isabella began, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she typically reserved for state occasions. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had expected another conversation about protocol or perhaps criticism of her recent public statements, but the formal nature of this gathering suggested something far more serious. "Your Majesty, I'm not sure I understand," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the growing anxiety she felt. Lord Hampton cleared his throat and opened a leather portfolio that had been resting on his lap. "Princess Elena, we have documentation of various activities and communications that suggest a pattern of behavior inconsistent with your royal duties and obligations," he said in his precise, clipped tone. "These include unauthorized policy discussions with foreign dignitaries, public statements that contradict established royal positions, and private correspondence that reveals intentions to undermine traditional royal authority." The words hit Elena like physical blows. She felt her face flush as she realized that her private letter to Professor Margaret Thornfield had been intercepted and read. The violation of her personal privacy was shocking enough, but the interpretation of her words as some kind of conspiracy against the monarchy was completely distorted from her true intentions. "I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding," Elena said, leaning forward in her chair. "My private correspondence with my former professor was never intended to suggest any disloyalty to the crown or to this family. I was simply expressing my hopes for positive change and modernization that could benefit our people." Isabella's expression did not soften. "The content of that letter, combined with your increasingly independent public activities, demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of your role within this institution," the Queen replied. "You have repeatedly acted in ways that challenge established protocol and undermine the stability that this monarchy represents." Sir Reginald Blackwood adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and consulted his own set of documents. "Princess Elena, your recent establishment of the Educational Opportunity Foundation was created without proper consultation with the Royal Charitable Trust, which coordinates all official royal philanthropic activities. Your foundation's mission statement includes language about systemic change and challenging inequality that implies criticism of current government policies." Elena felt a surge of frustration at the legalistic interpretation of her charitable work. "The foundation was created to help children receive better education," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I fail to see how providing scholarships and educational resources could be viewed as threatening to anyone." Colonel Sterling spoke for the first time, his military bearing evident in his posture and tone. "Princess Elena, your unscheduled visits to various locations throughout the kingdom have created security concerns and administrative complications. More importantly, your informal interactions with citizens often include discussions of political and social issues that exceed the appropriate boundaries for royal engagement." The princess felt the walls of the room closing in around her as she realized that every aspect of her public service had been monitored and interpreted in the most negative possible light. "I have been trying to serve the people of this kingdom with sincerity and compassion," Elena said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Every action I have taken has been motivated by genuine care for the welfare of our citizens." Isabella moved around her desk and stood directly in front of Elena, her imposing presence making the younger woman feel small and vulnerable. "Your motivations may be well-intentioned, but your methods and your fundamental approach to royal duty are incompatible with the requirements of this position," the Queen said. "You have demonstrated repeatedly that you either cannot or will not conform to the standards and expectations that have preserved this monarchy for centuries." Elena stood up from her chair, her legs slightly unsteady as the full implications of Isabella's words began to sink in. "Are you suggesting that I should abandon my efforts to help people? That I should limit myself to ceremonial appearances and polite conversation?" she asked, her voice gaining strength as her initial shock gave way to defiance. "I am telling you that your version of helping people threatens the very foundation of royal authority that allows us to serve effectively," Isabella replied, her tone becoming more heated. "Your progressive rhetoric and activist approach have already attracted criticism from our allies and created diplomatic complications that could have long-term consequences for this kingdom." Lord Hampton stood and handed Elena a thick document bound in blue leather. "Princess Elena, this is a formal notice of removal from all official royal duties, effective immediately. You will retain your title, but will no longer represent the crown in any public capacity. Your charitable foundation will be dissolved, and its assets will be transferred to existing royal charitable organizations." Elena stared at the document in her hands, unable to process the words she was reading. The legal language was dense and formal, but the meaning was clear. She was being stripped of everything that had given purpose and meaning to her role as a member of the royal family. "You cannot simply eliminate my foundation," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are children depending on those scholarships, programs that are already underway." Sir Reginald stood and approached Elena with another set of papers. "The legal framework for this action is quite clear," he said with professional detachment. "All royal charitable activities must operate under the umbrella of established royal institutions. Your foundation was created without proper authorization and therefore lacks legal standing as an official royal charity." The princess felt as though she was drowning in bureaucratic language and legal technicalities. Everything she had worked to build, every program she had fought to establish was being swept away by administrative decisions that reduced her efforts to paperwork and protocol violations. "What about Alexander?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Does my husband know about this decision?" Isabella's expression softened slightly, revealing the first hint of genuine emotion she had shown during the meeting. "Prince Alexander has been informed of our concerns, but this decision has been made by royal decree and does not require his consent," she said. "He will be given the opportunity to understand the necessity of this action in time." Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized that even her marriage was being subjected to royal protocol and institutional authority. "You cannot simply decide the future of my relationship with my husband," she said, her voice growing stronger with anger. "Alexander and I love each other, and we share a commitment to serving this kingdom together. Your relationship with Prince Alexander will continue, but your role as an active member of the royal family ends today," Isabella replied firmly. "You may remain at the palace as his wife, but you will not participate in official royal functions, public appearances, or any activities that represent the crown." The colonel cleared his throat and stepped forward with yet another document. "Princess Elena, this security briefing outlines the new protocols that will govern your activities going forward. You will no longer have access to classified information, diplomatic communications, or advance notice of royal family schedules. Your personal staff will be reassigned, and your official correspondence will be handled through appropriate channels." Elena looked around the room at the four faces staring at her with professional detachment, and she felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. These people were systematically dismantling everything that had connected her to the purpose and meaning she had found in royal service. They were reducing her to a decorative appendage to her husband's title, removing her voice and her agency in one calculated administrative action. "This is not justice," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tears that were beginning to form in her eyes. "This is punishment for having ideas and caring about people who are not represented in your vision of royal duty." Isabella moved closer to Elena, and for a moment, her expression showed something that might have been regret or sadness. "This is preservation, Elena. This is protecting an institution that has served this kingdom for 800 years from changes that could destroy everything we have built." Elena looked down at the documents in her hands, seeing her entire future reduced to legal language and official restrictions. She thought about the children who would not receive scholarships, the women's shelter that would not receive royal patronage, the educational programs that would never be implemented. All of her dreams for positive change were being sacrificed to preserve traditions that felt increasingly meaningless and hollow. "I need time to process this," Elena said finally, her voice barely audible. "I need to speak with Alexander." Isabella nodded slightly. "You may return to your chambers. Prince Alexander will join you this evening after his official duties are completed. I suggest you use the intervening time to consider how you will adapt to your new circumstances." Elena turned toward the door, her movements automatic and mechanical. As she reached for the handle, she heard Isabella's voice behind her one final time. "Elena, I want you to understand that this decision was not made lightly. But the survival of this monarchy depends on maintaining the delicate balance between tradition and change. Your vision of progress would ultimately destroy the very institution you claim to want to serve." The princess did not turn around or respond. She opened the door and walked out of the study, carrying the documents that had just redefined her entire existence. As she moved through the marble corridors toward her private chambers, she could not shake the feeling that she was walking through a beautiful prison where the bars were made of protocol and the locks were forged from tradition. Prince Alexander Thomas Edward was reviewing agricultural policy reports in the East Wing Library when his personal aide, James Whitmore, approached with an urgent message. The young prince had spent the morning in meetings with ministry officials discussing crop subsidies and rural development programs, unaware that his wife's life was being systematically dismantled 3 floors above his head. When James handed him the sealed envelope marked with Queen Isabella's personal crest, Alexander expected it to contain routine correspondence about upcoming state functions. Instead, he found a formal notification that Princess Elena had been stripped of all royal duties and that he was requested to meet with the Queen immediately following his afternoon commitments. The brief, official language of the message sent a cold shock through Alexander's chest, and he found himself reading the words multiple times, trying to make sense of what had happened during the few hours he had been focused on government business. Alexander had always prided himself on his ability to maintain composure under pressure, a skill Isabella had drilled into him from childhood. But, as he sat alone in the library, surrounded by centuries of royal history chronicled in leather-bound volumes, he felt his carefully constructed emotional control beginning to crumble. The woman he loved, the person who had brought joy and purpose into his life, was apparently being treated as a threat to everything his family represented. The prince had been aware of the growing tension between Elena and Isabella, but he had convinced himself that their disagreements were manageable through patience and diplomatic compromise. He had witnessed similar conflicts in other royal families, where generational differences and varying approaches to public service had eventually been resolved through mutual respect and understanding. Alexander had believed that Isabella's wisdom and Elena's compassion could ultimately find common ground in their shared commitment to serving the kingdom. Now, faced with this formal documentation of Elena's removal from royal duties, Alexander realized that he had been naive about the depth of the philosophical divide between the two women. Isabella's action represented a complete rejection of Elena's vision for modern monarchy, and it demonstrated a level of authoritarian control that Alexander had not fully understood or anticipated. The prince closed the agricultural reports and walked quickly through the palace corridors toward Elena's private chambers, his mind racing with questions about what had transpired and how he could possibly address this crisis. He passed familiar portraits of his ancestors, kings and queens who had navigated wars, political upheavals, and social transformations while maintaining the stability and continuity of the royal institution. For the first time in his life, Alexander wondered whether that historical legacy was worth preserving if it required sacrificing the happiness and dignity of the person he loved most. Elena's chambers were located in the south wing, where afternoon sunlight typically created a warm and welcoming atmosphere that had always provided Alexander with a sense of peace and refuge from official pressures. Today, however, the rooms felt different. Elena sat by the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, still holding the documents that had redefined her existence, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. When she heard Alexander enter, Elena looked up with an expression that combined relief at seeing him with heartbreak at having to share this devastating news. She had spent the last 3 hours alone, processing the magnitude of what had happened and trying to understand how her efforts to serve the kingdom had been transformed into evidence of disloyalty and subversion. "Alexander," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Isabella has expelled me from the royal family." The prince moved quickly across the room and knelt beside Elena's chair, taking her hands in his and feeling their coldness despite the warm afternoon air. "I received a message about some kind of change in your duties," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Tell me exactly what happened." Elena handed him the documents and watched as Alexander's face changed from confusion to disbelief to anger as he read through the formal language that had reduced her royal role to nothing. She described the meeting in Isabella's study, the accusations about her charitable work and private correspondence, and the cold, bureaucratic manner in which her entire public service had been dismantled. As Elena spoke, Alexander felt something breaking inside his chest. The woman who had taught him to see the monarchy as a vehicle for positive change, who had shown him the joy of connecting with ordinary citizens, who had brought authenticity and purpose to royal service, was being treated like a criminal for caring too much about people who needed help. "This is impossible," Alexander said, his voice rising with emotion. "You have done nothing wrong. Your work with children's education, your visits to hospitals and community centers, your efforts to modernize our approach to public service. These are exactly the kinds of activities that make the monarchy relevant and meaningful to contemporary society." Elena touched his face gently, seeing the pain and confusion in his eyes. "Isabella believes that my approach threatens the stability of royal authority," she said. "She thinks that my ideas about change and progress will ultimately damage the institution that has served this kingdom for centuries." Alexander stood and began pacing around the room, his usual calm demeanor completely shattered by the injustice of what had been done to his wife. "Isabella has forgotten that the monarchy exists to serve the people, not the other way around," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "Your work represents the best of what royal service can accomplish. You have connected with citizens in ways that make them proud of their kingdom and hopeful about their future." The prince paused by the window and looked out at the manicured gardens where he and Elena had walked countless times, discussing their dreams for their life together and their shared vision for meaningful public service. Those conversations had shaped his understanding of what it meant to be a modern royal, and they had given him hope that his future reign could be both respectful of tradition and responsive to contemporary needs. "I will not accept this decision," Alexander declared, turning back to face Elena with determination in his voice. "Isabella may be queen, but she does not have the right to destroy your life or our partnership simply because she disagrees with your approach to royal duty." Elena felt a surge of love and gratitude for Alexander's support, but she also recognized the impossible position that Isabella's action had created for him. "Alexander, you cannot directly challenge the Queen's authority without creating a constitutional crisis," she said. "Your future as king depends on maintaining the respect and confidence of the royal council, the government, and the people. If you defy Isabella publicly, you risk undermining your own legitimacy." The prince sat down beside Elena and took her hands again, his touch conveying both love and determination. "My legitimacy as a future king will be meaningless if it requires me to abandon the person I love and the principles that give my life purpose," he said. "I will not be a king who rules over a system that crushes compassion and punishes people for caring about justice and equality." As they sat together in the fading afternoon light, both Alexander and Elena understood that they were facing a choice that would define not only their personal relationship, but also the future direction of the monarchy itself. Isabella's action had forced a confrontation between two fundamentally different visions of what royal service should represent in the modern world. Elena had always known that her progressive ideas and activist approach would create tensions within the traditional royal framework, but she had believed that love, patience, and demonstrated results could gradually win over even the most conservative critics. Isabella's harsh response had shattered that optimistic assumption and revealed the depth of resistance that existed to any meaningful change within the royal institution. Alexander, meanwhile, was discovering that his position as heir to the throne came with constraints and expectations that he had not fully appreciated. He had assumed that his future authority would give him the freedom to shape the monarchy according to his values and vision, but Isabella's treatment of Elena demonstrated that even princes were subject to institutional forces that could override personal desires and individual conscience. As evening approached, Alexander knew that he was expected to meet with Isabella to discuss the new arrangements and receive his instructions about how to handle the situation publicly. The prospect of that conversation filled him with dread, because he knew that it would require him to choose between loyalty to the woman who had raised him and loyalty to the woman he had chosen to marry. Elena encouraged Alexander to attend the meeting with Isabella, despite her own fears about what additional restrictions or consequences might be imposed. She recognized that avoiding the confrontation would only make the situation worse, and she hoped that a direct conversation between Alexander and Isabella might reveal possibilities for compromise or alternative solutions. The prince kissed Elena goodbye and walked slowly through the palace corridors toward Isabella's study, feeling like he was walking toward his own execution. Every step carried him further away from the person who had brought love and meaning into his life, and closer to a confrontation that would test every relationship and loyalty he had ever known. As he approached Isabella's door, Alexander tried to prepare himself mentally for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of his life. He knew that Isabella would present her decision as a necessary protection of royal authority and institutional stability. She would argue that Elena's removal was a temporary measure designed to allow time for reflection and adaptation to royal expectations. But Alexander also knew that Isabella's action represented a fundamental rejection of everything that Elena stood for and everything that their partnership had accomplished. The queen had not simply disagreed with Elena's methods or questioned her judgment. She had denied Elena's basic right to use her position for meaningful public service and authentic human connection. The prince paused outside Isabella's study, his hand on the door handle, knowing that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether his future reign would be built on love and justice or on tradition and authoritarian control. He thought about Elena sitting alone in her chambers, stripped of her royal duties but not diminished in her commitment to serving others, and he felt his resolve strengthen for the battle that lay ahead. Queen Isabella stood by the tall windows of her study as Alexander entered, her silhouette outlined against the darkening sky. She had dismissed her advisors an hour earlier and spent the intervening time preparing herself mentally for what she knew would be the most challenging conversation of her reign. The queen understood that her decision to remove Elena from royal duties had created an irreparable rift in her relationship with her stepson, but she remained convinced that protecting the monarchy required difficult choices that transcended personal feelings and family loyalty. Alexander closed the door behind him and remained standing near the entrance, his posture rigid with controlled anger. The prince had spent the walk to Isabella's study rehearsing various approaches to this confrontation, but now that he faced the woman who had shaped his understanding of royal duty and responsibility, he found himself struggling to contain his emotions. "Sit down, Alexander," Isabella said without turning around. Her voice carried the authoritative tone she had used throughout his childhood when serious discipline was required. But Alexander remained standing. "We need to discuss the arrangements going forward and your role in managing this transition." "There will be no transition," Alexander replied, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I will not accept your decision to strip Elena of her royal duties, and I will not participate in any arrangements that treat my wife as though she has committed some crime against the crown." Isabella finally turned to face Alexander, her emerald eyes reflecting both sadness and steely resolve. She had raised this young man from the age of 12, guiding him through the complexities of royal life and preparing him for the responsibilities that would one day rest on his shoulders. Now she was watching him make choices that she believed would ultimately destroy everything she had worked to preserve. "Alexander, your emotional attachment to Elena is preventing you from seeing the broader implications of her actions," Isabella said, moving toward her desk and gesturing for him to take a seat. This decision was not made hastily or vindicatively. It was made to protect the institutional integrity that allows the monarchy to serve effectively. The prince remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides as he struggled to process Isabella's characterization of his love for Elena as merely an emotional attachment that clouded his judgment. "Elena has served this kingdom with more genuine compassion and effectiveness than anyone in this palace," he said, his voice rising. "She has connected with our citizens in ways that make them proud to be part of this kingdom. Your decision punishes excellence and rewards conformity." Isabella sat down behind her desk and opened the leather portfolio that contained her documentation of Elena's activities and communications. "Your wife's definition of service includes challenging government policies, promoting radical social changes, and encouraging citizens to question traditional authority structures," she said. "These activities may seem compassionate, but they undermine the stability that allows the monarchy to function as a unifying force above political division." Alexander moved closer to Isabella's desk, his calm diplomatic training finally giving way to raw emotion. "Elena has never questioned legitimate authority or promoted anything radical," he said. "She has simply insisted that royal privilege should be used to help people who need assistance rather than to maintain comfortable distance from real problems." The queen removed Elena's intercepted letter from her portfolio and placed it on the desk between them. "Your wife described the monarchy as a beautiful prison and expressed her determination to break free from what she called outdated constraints," Isabella said. "These are not the words of someone who respects the institution she has sworn to serve." Alexander stared at the letter, feeling a deep violation at the invasion of Elena's privacy, but also understanding for the first time how Isabella had been able to build such a comprehensive case against his wife. "Elena was expressing frustration with arbitrary limitations on her ability to help people," he said. "The fact that you have been reading her private correspondence suggests that she was right about feeling imprisoned." Isabella's expression hardened as she realized that Alexander was not going to be persuaded by legal arguments or institutional concerns. "I have been reading correspondence that passes through palace communications systems because it is my responsibility to protect this monarchy from internal and external threats," she said. "Elena's progressive agenda represents exactly the kind of internal threat that has destroyed royal families throughout history." The prince leaned forward, placing his hands on Isabella's desk as he stared directly into her eyes. "The only threat to this monarchy is the kind of authoritarian thinking that treats compassion as subversion and treats people who care about justice as enemies," he said. "Elena represents everything that is good and noble about royal service, and your decision to expel her reveals everything that is petty and fearful about traditional royal thinking." Isabella stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward as she matched Alexander's intense stare. "You are speaking to your queen, Alexander, not to a peer or colleague, she said, her voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. Your marriage to Elena has clearly compromised your understanding of appropriate behavior and respect for the chain of command that governs this institution. For a moment, the study fell completely silent except for the ticking of the ornate clock on Isabella's mantle. Alexander realized that Isabella had just confirmed his worst fear about her motivations. She viewed Elena not only as a threat to royal tradition, but as a corrupting influence on his own judgment and loyalty. The queen was not simply removing Elena from royal duties. She was attempting to reclaim psychological control over Alexander himself. My marriage to Elena has taught me what it means to use royal privilege for meaningful purposes, Alexander said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. She has shown me that the monarchy can be a force for positive change rather than simply a ceremonial institution that preserves inequality and injustice. Isabella walked around her desk and stood directly in front of Alexander, her presence imposing despite the emotional distance that had opened between them. Elena has taught you to question fundamental principles that have preserved this kingdom through centuries of political upheaval and social change, she said. Her vision of activist monarchy would turn the royal family into another political party, subject to the same partisan divisions and temporary popularity that characterized democratic institutions. The prince stepped back slightly, not in deference to Isabella's authority, but to gain perspective on the philosophical chasm that separated their worldviews. Elena's vision recognizes that the monarchy must earn legitimacy through service rather than demanding loyalty through tradition, he said. The citizens of this kingdom deserve royal leaders who understand their struggles and work actively to address their needs. Isabella moved to the fireplace where portraits of Alexander's ancestors looked down from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to witness this confrontation between competing visions of royal duty. These kings and queens maintained their authority by remaining above partisan politics and social conflicts, she said, gesturing toward the portraits. They provided stability and continuity that allowed democratic institutions to function without the chaos that would result from constant revolutionary change. Alexander followed Isabella's gaze to the portraits, but instead of seeing noble examples of traditional leadership, he saw evidence of an outdated system that had failed to adapt to contemporary needs and expectations. Those kings and queens ruled subjects who had no voice in their government and no expectation of social mobility or economic opportunity, he said. Elena and I are preparing to lead citizens who deserve better than ceremonial leadership that ignores their real concerns. The queen turned back to Alexander with an expression that combined disappointment with determination. You are forcing me to choose between my love for you and my duty to protect this monarchy, she said. If you continue to support Elena's approach and refuse to accept the boundaries that define appropriate royal behavior, you will be creating a constitutional crisis that could threaten your own position as heir. Alexander felt the full weight of Isabella's ultimatum settling over him like a heavy cloak. She was not simply asking him to accept Elena's removal from royal duties. She was demanding that he choose between his wife and his crown. The implications of that choice extended far beyond their personal relationship to encompass everything he had believed about his future role and responsibilities. Are you threatening to remove me from the line of succession if I do not abandon my wife? Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them like an undrawn sword, carrying the potential to destroy not only their family relationship, but also the constitutional foundations of the monarchy itself. Isabella's expression showed genuine pain at having reached this moment, but her voice remained steady and authoritative. I am telling you that the survival of this monarchy depends on maintaining institutional discipline and respect for established authority, she said. If you cannot provide that leadership, then the royal council will need to consider alternative arrangements for the succession. The prince stared at Isabella in shocked silence as he realized that she was prepared to destroy not only Elena's life, but also his own future in order to preserve her vision of royal tradition. The woman who had raised him, protected him, and prepared him for kingship was now threatening to strip away everything she had given him because he refused to sacrifice the person he loved. Alexander moved toward the door, knowing that he needed time and distance to process the magnitude of what Isabella had revealed about her priorities and her willingness to use authoritarian power against her own family. I will not choose between Elena and my royal duties because I refuse to accept the premise that loving her makes me unfit to serve this kingdom, he said as he reached for the door handle. Isabella called out to him one final time as he prepared to leave. Alexander, if you walk out of this room without accepting these arrangements, you will be choosing a path that leads away from everything you have been raised to value and protect. I pray that you will reconsider before it is too late. The prince paused at the door and looked back at Isabella with sadness rather than anger. I have been raised to value duty, honor, and service to others, he said. Elena embodies all of those values more perfectly than anyone I have ever known. If protecting her makes me unfit to be king, then this kingdom deserves better leadership than either of us can provide. Alexander left Isabella's study knowing that his life would never be the same, and that the choice he was making would have consequences that extended far beyond his personal happiness to affect the future of the monarchy and the kingdom itself. The days following Alexander's confrontation with Queen Isabella passed in a surreal suspension of normal palace routine. News of Princess Elena's removal from royal duties had been contained within the inner circle of palace staff and advisors, but the absence of her usual activities created ripples of curiosity and concern throughout the royal household. Elena's scheduled visit to the women's shelter was quietly canceled, her speech to the National Education Association was postponed indefinitely, and her regular correspondence with charitable organizations ceased without explanation. Alexander had returned to Elena's chambers that evening with a face that revealed the devastating nature of his conversation with Isabella. Elena read the truth in his eyes before he spoke a word. Isabella had not only expelled her from royal duties but had threatened Alexander's own position if he continued to support her vision of modern monarchy. The couple spent the night talking quietly about their impossible situation, holding each other as they tried to process the magnitude of the choice they were being forced to make. Elena insisted that Alexander could not sacrifice his future reign for her sake, arguing that his eventual kingship represented the best hope for implementing the progressive changes they both believed were necessary. Alexander countered that a crown obtained through abandoning the person he loved would be worthless, and that accepting Isabella's ultimatum would make him complicit in the authoritarian thinking that Elena's expulsion represented. By morning, they had reached a decision that surprised even themselves with its clarity and boldness. If the monarchy could not accommodate Elena's approach to royal service, and if Alexander's legitimacy depended on accepting limitations that violated their shared principles, then they would create their own path outside the traditional royal framework. The plan they developed over the following week was both simple and revolutionary. Alexander would formally renounce his position as heir to the throne, citing his belief that the monarchy needed fundamental reform that he was not permitted to implement from within the institution. Elena would establish her charitable foundation as an independent organization, free from royal oversight and protocol restrictions. Together, they would work to demonstrate that meaningful public service did not require official titles or institutional authority. Alexander arranged a private meeting with his younger brother, Prince Frederick, to discuss the implications of his decision and to ensure that the succession would pass to someone capable of responsible leadership. Frederick, 24 years old and more traditionally minded than Alexander, initially expressed shock at his brother's plan, but gradually came to understand the philosophical crisis that had made such drastic action necessary. I cannot say that I agree with Elena's approach to royal duty, Frederick told Alexander during their conversation in the palace gardens. But I respect your integrity in refusing to abandon your principles or your wife. If you truly believe that you cannot serve effectively under current constraints, then stepping aside may be the most honorable choice available. Frederick's support provided Alexander with crucial reassurance that his decision would not create a succession crisis or leave the kingdom without capable future leadership. The younger prince had always been more comfortable with traditional royal limitations and ceremonial responsibilities, and he possessed the diplomatic temperament that would allow him to work effectively with Isabella and the royal council. Elena, meanwhile, had been quietly contacting her network of educational reformers, social activists, and charitable organizers to build support for her independent foundation. She discovered that her removal from official royal duties had actually increased interest in her work among people who viewed her treatment as evidence of the monarchy's resistance to necessary social change. Professor Margaret Thornfield, Elena's former university mentor, offered to serve as academic advisor for the new foundation and to help establish partnerships with educational institutions throughout the kingdom. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, director of the women's shelter Elena had planned to visit, volunteered to coordinate with other social service organizations to create comprehensive support networks that could operate without official royal patronage. Most surprisingly, Elena received a confidential message of support from several younger members of the royal family, including Prince Frederick's wife Princess Charlotte and two of Alexander's cousins who served in minor royal capacities. These family members privately expressed their admiration for Elena's courage and their hope that her independent work would eventually influence positive changes within the monarchy itself. As word of Alexander's planned renunciation began to circulate within palace circles, Queen Isabella made one final attempt to prevent what she viewed as a catastrophic decision. She arranged a private dinner with Alexander and Elena, hoping that a more informal setting might allow for compromise and reconciliation. The dinner took place in Isabella's private dining room, an intimate space where family meals had been shared throughout Alexander's youth. The queen had prepared Elena's favorite dishes and decorated the table with flowers from the palace gardens, creating an atmosphere that emphasized personal relationships rather than institutional conflicts. Isabella began the evening by acknowledging that her handling of the situation had been harsh and perhaps unnecessarily formal. She expressed genuine regret for the pain her decisions had caused and admitted that she might have been too quick to interpret Elena's activities as threatening rather than well-intentioned. "I have spent 20 years protecting this monarchy from changes that could weaken its effectiveness," Isabella said as they shared dessert. "Perhaps I have become too cautious about innovation and too suspicious of new approaches to royal service. Elena, I want you to know that I have never questioned your sincerity or your dedication to helping others." Elena appreciated Isabella's conciliatory tone, but she had learned not to mistake politeness for genuine acceptance of her values and methods. "Your Majesty, I understand your concerns about preserving royal authority and maintaining stability," Elena replied. "But I cannot accept limitations that prevent me from using my position to address real suffering and injustice in our society." Isabella proposed a compromise that would allow Elena to resume limited royal duties under strict oversight and guidance. Elena would be permitted to continue her charitable work within established royal frameworks, but her activities would be coordinated through the Royal Charitable Trust to ensure consistency with traditional protocols. Alexander listened to Isabella's proposal with growing frustration, recognizing that it represented exactly the kind of superficial accommodation that would satisfy institutional requirements while gutting the authentic engagement that made Elena's work effective. The compromise would allow Elena to appear at ceremonial events and make supervised charitable contributions, but it would eliminate her direct contact with ordinary citizens and her advocacy for systemic change. "Isabella, your proposal would turn Elena into a decorative figurehead rather than allowing her to serve as an effective advocate for people who need help," Alexander said. "We appreciate your willingness to reconsider, but cosmetic changes will not address the fundamental disagreement about what royal service should accomplish." The dinner ended with polite expressions of mutual respect, but both sides understood that the philosophical divide was too deep for compromise. Isabella remained convinced that Elena's approach would ultimately damage the monarchy's effectiveness, while Alexander and Elena believed that accepting limitations on their principles would make their royal service meaningless. 3 weeks after Elena's initial expulsion from royal duties, Alexander formally submitted his letter of renunciation to the Royal Council. The document cited his belief that the monarchy needed comprehensive reform to remain relevant to contemporary citizens, and his conviction that such reform was impossible to achieve within current institutional constraints. The public announcement of Alexander's renunciation created a sensation throughout the kingdom and internationally. News media struggled to understand how a popular prince could voluntarily abandon his position as heir to the throne, and speculation about palace conflicts and personal scandals dominated headlines for weeks. Elena and Alexander used the media attention to announce the creation of their independent foundation, dedicated to educational opportunity, social justice, and direct engagement with communities throughout the kingdom. They explained that their decision to leave official royal service reflected their commitment to meaningful public service rather than ceremonial representation. Public reaction to their announcement was deeply divided. Traditional monarchists viewed Alexander's renunciation as a betrayal of duty and a dangerous precedent that could destabilize the institution. Progressive citizens, however, praised the couple for choosing principles over privilege and for demonstrating that public service could exist outside traditional power structures. 6 months later, Elena and Alexander had established a thriving network of educational programs, community development projects, and social advocacy initiatives that reached more citizens than their previous royal duties had ever allowed. They worked directly with local organizers, lived modestly in a renovated farmhouse outside the capital, and discovered that their independence from royal protocol had actually increased their effectiveness as public servants. Queen Isabella, meanwhile, continued to rule with traditional authority while gradually implementing minor reforms that reflected some of Elena's original suggestions. She privately admitted to close advisors that Elena's departure had removed a valuable source of fresh perspectives, but she maintained that protecting institutional stability had required the difficult decisions she had made. Prince Frederick's eventual coronation as the new heir was marked by both continuity and change. He promised to maintain royal traditions while remaining open to gradual modernization that would serve the evolving needs of the kingdom's citizens. His approach satisfied both traditionalists and reformers, though neither group achieved the complete victory they had hoped for. Elena and Alexander's marriage not only survived their dramatic break from royal life, but flourished in ways that had been impossible within the constraints of palace protocol. They found that their shared commitment to service and justice created a partnership that was stronger than any institutional authority or traditional expectation. Their story became a testament to the possibility of choosing love and principles over power and privilege, demonstrating that meaningful public service could exist outside established institutions, and that personal integrity sometimes required the courage to walk away from everything that seemed secure and valuable. Years later, historians would debate whether Elena's expulsion and Alexander's renunciation had strengthened or weakened the monarchy, but there was no question that their choice had expanded the definition of what public service could accomplish when guided by authentic compassion rather than institutional obligation.